Elias Thorne moved with the slow, deliberate economy of a man who had made peace with solitude. His world was a small, hand-built cabin tucked into the granite knuckles of the Dragoon Mountains, a place where the silence was so profound it seemed to have weight and substance. He was a man in his late 30s, but the Arizona sun had etched lines around his eyes that spoke of more years than he had lived, and the sorrow that swam in their gray depths was older than time itself. He had come from the east 5 years before, a hollowed-out vessel of a man, leaving behind 2 small graves in a Pennsylvania churchyard. Cholera had taken his wife, Sarah, and then his boy, Thomas, with a swift, merciless cruelty that had scoured the soul right out of him. He never spoke their names, not even to himself. Their memory lived in the silence, in the way he would pause, his hand on an axe handle, and stare at the vast, indifferent horizon until the ache in his chest subsided into a familiar, dull throb. He had come west not to find something, but to lose himself. His days were a simple catechism of survival. Dawn found him checking the trap lines he had set in the shadowed canyons, his haul usually meager, a rabbit, a squirrel, enough to keep him from starving. The mornings were for mending the split-rail fence that kept his single, sturdy horse from wandering, or for reinforcing the adobe walls of his cabin against the coming heat of summer. Afternoons were spent in the shade of a meager overhang, cleaning his rifle or sharpening his knife, his gaze always sweeping across the landscape. The land itself was his only constant companion. It was a brutal and magnificent thing, a panorama of sprawling mesas the color of dried blood, deep canyons that hid secrets and shadows, and a sky so vast and blue it could make a man feel like an insignificant speck. The air smelled of dust and creosote and the clean, sharp scent of pine from the higher elevations. It was an unforgiving place, a land that offered no comfort and asked for nothing in return but a man's resilience. It suited Elias perfectly. That afternoon, the sky began to change. The endless blue was slowly consumed by a bruised, purple-gray mass that rolled in from the southeast. The air grew thick and heavy, the kind of stillness that precedes violence. The cicadas, which had been buzzing with a manic energy, fell silent. Elias was in the small corral, running a curry comb over the dusty coat of his bay gelding. Buck, when the first drop of rain hit the back of his neck, it was not a gentle drop, but a fat, heavy splat that left a dark circle in the dust. Another followed, then another. Within minutes, the sky opened up. This was no eastern shower. This was a summer monsoon, a deluge of biblical proportions. The rain did not fall so much as it was thrown from the heavens, a solid sheet of water that turned the world into a churning, gray blur. The hard-packed earth, baked by months of relentless sun, could not absorb the onslaught. The water slicked the ground, then pooled, then began to move, seeking the lowest points. The dry arroyos and washes that crisscrossed the landscape became arteries for the storm's fury, transforming in an instant from dusty scars into raging torrents of thick, brown water. The sound was a deafening roar, a combination of the pounding rain and the grinding of rocks and debris being carried along by the flood. Elias led Buck into the lean-to that served as a stable, his clothes soaked through in seconds. The horse was skittish, his eyes wide and rolling at the cacophony of the storm. Elias spoke to him in a low, soothing murmur, his voice a frail thread against the tempest's roar. It was then that he heard it, or thought he heard it. It was a sound so faint, so thin, it was almost indistinguishable from the shriek of the wind as it tore through the juniper trees. A cry, high-pitched and desperate. He froze, his hand resting on Buck's quivering flank, and strained to listen. The wind howled, the rain hammered the tin roof of the lean-to, and for a moment he thought he had imagined it, a trick of the storm. But then it came again, fainter this time, swallowed almost immediately by the thunder that cracked directly overhead. It was a human sound, a gut instinct, a deep primal impulse that had lain dormant for years, surged through him. It was the same instinct that made a man run toward a burning house or shield a child from harm. It was a feeling he thought had been buried with his family, Without conscious thought, he turned from the horse and ran out into the storm. The rain was a physical blow, blinding him, but he knew this land. He scrambled down the slick, muddy slope from his cabin toward the large arroyo at the bottom of the canyon. He could hear it before he could see it. A low, guttural growl that grew into a deafening roar. When he reached the edge, he stopped, his breath catching in his throat. What had been a 30-foot-wide ribbon of sand and rock an hour ago was now a roiling, muddy river, a churning beast of water filled with uprooted trees, branches, and all the debris of the desert floor. The flood was a living thing, angry and destructive. He scanned the violent current, his eyes narrowed against the driving rain. And then he saw it. A flash of buckskin, a tangle of black hair, a body, tossed and tumbled in the debris-choked water like a broken doll. It would be swept downstream, battered against the rocks, and drowned in moments. There was no time for a second thought, no time for weighing the risk to his own life. The part of him that was a husband and a father, the part he had tried so hard to kill, screamed into life. He sprinted back to the lean-to, his boots sliding in the thick mud, and snatched the lariat from his saddle horn. He ran back to the edge of the flood, his mind working with a desperate clarity. He found a sturdy, deep-rooted juniper tree a few feet from the bank, quickly looped one end of the rope around its thick trunk, and secured it with a knot that would hold against the devil himself. He tied the other end around his waist, pulling it tight. He took a deep breath, the cold, rain-filled air burning his lungs, and waded into the maelstrom. The force of the water was staggering. It tore at his legs, trying to pull him from his feet. The current was an icy, muscular thing, and the mud underfoot was slick and treacherous. He leaned into the rope, using it as an anchor. His eyes locked on the body as it was swept closer. It was a woman. He could see that now. Young. Her head was submerged, then thrown back up, then pulled under again. He pushed forward, the water now up to his chest, his whole body straining against the pull of the flood. Debris slammed into him, a heavy branch that bruised his ribs, a cascade of smaller sticks that clawed at his face. She was almost past him. He had one chance. With a final, desperate lunge, he threw himself forward, his arm outstretched. His fingers brushed against the soft, slick buckskin of her dress, slipped, and then caught. He got a firm hold on her arm, the shock of contact, of holding another human being, jolting him to his core. The current seized them both, pulling them violently. The rope around his waist went taut with a groan, biting into his flesh, but it held. The juniper tree held. Elias dug his heels into the shifting riverbed and began the agonizing process of dragging them both back to the shore. It was a battle of inches. The weight of the woman's limp body and the relentless power of the water seemed determined to drag them both under. His muscles screamed, his lungs burned, but he did not let go. He pulled, grunting with the effort, his face a mask of grim determination, until he finally stumbled out of the main current and onto the muddy, sloping bank. He collapsed onto his hands and knees, gasping for breath, and dragged her the rest of the way out of the water's reach. She lay utterly still, a heap of wet buckskin and tangled black hair, her face pale and bluish under its copper skin. He rolled her onto her back. She was Apache. He knew from her high cheekbones, the style of her dress, the beaded moccasins on her feet. A girl, really, no more than 19 or 20. He put his ear to her mouth. There was no breath. He pressed his fingers to her neck. There was no pulse. A cold, hard panic seized him, colder than the rain that still pelted down on them. He had seen death. He had sat by his wife's bedside and held his son's small, still hand. He knew its finality, but this was different. This life was in his hands, a life he had just pulled from the jaws of the flood. He would not let it be taken now. He had never done this, had only heard stories of it from a doctor back east, a desperate measure when all else failed. He straddled her hips, placed the heel of one hand on the center of her chest, covered it with his other hand, and pushed, hard and fast. He counted under his breath, his movements rhythmic and forceful, trying to force the water from her lungs, to start the silent clock of her heart. 1, 2, 3, 4. He pushed again and again, his arms aching, mud and rain plastering his hair to his forehead. Nothing. Her body remained limp and lifeless beneath his hands. Desperation clawed at his throat. He could feel the seconds slipping away. Precious seconds. There was one last thing, the thing the doctor had spoken of with a grimace, an act of last resort. He stopped pressing on her chest and moved up, kneeling beside her head. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was a line he had never imagined crossing. In this harsh land, the lines between his people and hers were drawn in blood and suspicion. To touch was a risk. This was something more. He did not hesitate. The instinct to preserve life, raw and absolute, overrode everything else. He tilted her head back gently, the wet strands of her hair like cold silk against his fingers. He pinched her nose shut with his thumb and forefinger. Then, leaning down, he sealed his mouth over hers and breathed out, forcing the air from his own lungs into hers. The act was one of shocking intimacy. Her lips were cold and unresponsive beneath his. In the frantic urgency of the moment, he was only vaguely aware of the transgression, the profound violation of custom and space. He was aware only of the desperate hope that this might work. He pulled back, watched her still chest, and then did it again, breathing his life into her. He repeated the rhythm, pressing on her chest, then breathing into her mouth. The world narrowed to this small, desperate space on a muddy riverbank, the storm raging around them unheard. There was only the girl's still face, the feel of her cold lips, and the frantic, silent prayer in his own heart. After what felt like an eternity, as he leaned down for another breath, her body convulsed beneath him, a violent, racking spasm. She arched her back, and a gush of muddy water spewed from her mouth. She choked, coughed again, her body racked with tremors. Her eyelids fluttered, then opened. Her eyes were dark, almost black, and for a split second they were unfocused. Then they locked on his face, inches from her own. They widened, not with gratitude, but with sheer, undiluted terror. Her first conscious sensation was not the life returning to her limbs, but the alien feeling of this white man's breath still warm on her lips. Her first sight was not the sky or the trees, but his face, the face of an enemy looming over her. Her name was Naylan, and in that moment, she believed she had been saved from one death only to be delivered to another. A raw, guttural cry tore from her throat. It was a sound of primal fear. With a strength born of terror, she scrambled away from him, crab-walking backward through the mud, her movements clumsy and weak but driven by a fierce, defiant spirit. He was not a savior to her. He was a violation, a source of profound danger. His touch, his breath, had been an intrusion of the deepest kind. She tried to push herself to her feet, to run, but her legs were trembling and weak. She staggered, took a single step, and then her body gave out. She collapsed into the mud, exhausted from the ordeal, but she kept her eyes fixed on him, burning with a mixture of fear and hatred. Elias, breathing heavily, pushed himself to his feet and backed away slowly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. The adrenaline that had fueled him began to recede, and the full gravity of the situation crashed down upon him. He saw the terror in her eyes, the raw loathing, and he understood its source. He had saved her life, but in a way that had shattered the unwritten laws of their separate worlds. He had breathed his spirit into her, an act so intimate it was a kind of ownership, a kind of defilement. The storm showed no sign of letting up. The rain continued to fall in cold, miserable sheets, and the wind howled through the canyon. Leaving her here was a death sentence. Taking her back to his cabin was an unknown, dangerous risk. Travel for either of them was impossible. He pointed to a large, overhanging rock ledge 50 yards away, a place that offered some meager shelter from the relentless downpour. He looked at her, then at the ledge, then back at her, the gesture a clear, simple offer. She shook her head, her jaw set. Her distrust was absolute. She would rather face the storm alone than accept help from him, but the cold was beginning to seep into her bones, and a violent shiver ran through her exhausted body. The wind picked up, driving the rain sideways with stinging force. Her survival instinct, honed by a life in this unforgiving land, began to war with her fear. He was a danger, but the storm was a certainty. Elias stood perfectly still, letting her make the choice. He watched the struggle play out on her face. Finally, with another convulsive shiver, her fierce defiance seemed to crumble, replaced by a weary resignation. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He moved toward her slowly, cautiously, as one might approach a wounded, cornered animal. She flinched when he got close, but she allowed him to help her to her feet. She leaned on him heavily as he guided her across the muddy ground to the meager shelter of the rock ledge. He helped her sit with her back against the cold stone. Then he moved to the other side of the small, dry space, putting a careful distance between them. They sat in silence, separated by a chasm of culture, language, and fear. The only sound was the roar of the flood and the relentless drumming of the rain on the rock above their heads. The cold, damp air settled around them, heavy with the unspoken consequences of the act that had just bound their fates together. Elias looked at the terrified young woman across from him, and for the first time in 5 years, his solitude felt truly, completely broken. And he did not know if that was a blessing or a curse. Under the rock ledge, the world had shrunk to a small pocket of damp earth and cold stone. The air was thick with the smell of wet ground and the acrid smoke from the fire Elias was coaxing to life. Hours had passed in a silence so heavy it felt like a third person sitting between them. The storm, having spent its initial fury, had settled into a steady, monotonous drumming, a constant reminder of their shared prison. Naylin huddled on the far side of the shallow cave, as far from him as she could get. She had wrapped her arms tightly around her torso, a futile attempt to ward off the bone-deep chill that had taken root in her. Her buckskin dress, heavy and cold with water, clung to her skin. But it was not just the cold that made her tremble. Her dark eyes, wide and luminous in the flickering firelight, never left Elias. They were the eyes of a hawk, missing nothing, assessing his every small movement. Her mind was a raging torrent, much like the one that had almost claimed her. This white man, this Inda, had pulled her from the water, by the laws of the spirit. Her life now belonged to him in a way. It was a debt that could never be truly repaid, a tether that now connected their souls. But the manner of his saving her was a deep and terrible wound. He had put his mouth on hers, forced his breath, his ghost, into her body, to her people, the Chiricahua. The breath was the spirit. He had mingled his essence with hers, an act that could taint her, make her unclean in the eyes of her family and the spirits of her ancestors. She had been saved from drowning only to be spiritually defiled. She looked at him now, this quiet, sad-eyed man, and saw both her savior and her destroyer. Elias worked on the fire, his movements slow and methodical. He had gathered a small pile of damp twigs and branches from the edge of their shelter and was patiently shaving thin curls from a dry piece of wood he'd pulled from his coat pocket. He understood her fear. He had seen it in the eyes of cornered animals and, more chillingly, in the eyes of other natives he had encountered in his years in the territory. He was a white man, and that alone made him a threat. The intimate, desperate act he had performed on the riverbank had only magnified that threat into something monstrous in her mind. He knew that any sudden move, any word spoken too loudly, would send her bolting back out into the storm. So he kept his back to her, creating a small, smoky flame that sputtered and fought for life before finally catching. The fire pushed a fragile circle of warmth and orange light into the damp gloom. He sat back on his heels and watched her, not directly, but with sidelong glances. He saw the fear. Yes, but beneath it, he saw a formidable strength in the set of her jaw and the proud line of her neck. Her face, though pale with exhaustion and shock, was intelligent and watchful. He felt a strange and heavy sense of responsibility for her, a connection that had been forged not just by his actions, but by the sheer, random violence of the storm that had thrown them together. She was a life he had held in his hands, and he could not simply let her go. The hours bled into one another. The rain slowly softened, its roar diminishing to a steady patter, and the churning of the nearby flood lessened to a deep murmur. The world outside their small shelter was beginning to find its peace. The tension inside, however, remained. Elias reached into a leather pouch at his belt and pulled out a strip of dried venison. It was hard and dark, but it was sustenance. He broke it in two, the sound of the snap unnaturally loud in the quiet. He held out a piece to her, his expression neutral, his movements unhurried. It was a simple gesture, an offering of food, one of the oldest and most basic forms of communication. Nolan's eyes darted from the meat to his face and back again, her stomach, empty and aching, clenched with a sharp pang of hunger. The smell of the smoked meat, faint as it was, filled her senses. For a long, tense moment, she did nothing. Her pride and her deep-seated mistrust warred with the fundamental, animal need for food. To accept something from him was to accept a connection, to deepen the debt she already owed. But the gnawing hunger was a powerful argument. Her body, depleted by the fight for survival, craved the strength the food would provide. Slowly, hesitantly, she uncurled one hand and reached out. She did not take it from his fingers but gestured for him to place it on the ground between them. Elias understood and set the piece of venison on a flat, clean stone. She watched him for another long moment before snatching it up. She turned slightly away from him and began to eat, tearing at the tough meat with her teeth in small, cautious bites, as if expecting it to be poisoned. This small act, this sharing of a simple meal, became their first unspoken truce. It did not erase the fear or the chasm between them, but it built a thin, fragile bridge across it. They ate in their shared silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the quiet chewing of their food. As the venison warmed her belly, Nolan's thoughts drifted. The taste of the smoked meat reminded her of her mother, of sitting by a campfire in a hidden canyon, learning to scrape hides while her father told stories of coyote and the creation of the people. The memory was a sharp, sudden pain in her chest. A month. It had only been a month since her world had been burned to ash. The memory came in fractured, terrible images. The sudden crack of rifles while the camp was still sleeping, the screams of her people, the smell of blood and burning canvas. She had seen her father fall, his chest stained with a dark blossom of red. She had seen her mother dragged from their wickiup, her face a mask of defiance, before she, too, was cut down. The soldiers, the blue coats, had moved through their camp with a terrifying efficiency, their faces grim and pitiless. In the chaotic aftermath, the survivors of her small band had gathered, their numbers decimated, their spirits broken. It was then that the elders had told her she was to be given to Kale. He was a fierce warrior from another, larger band of Chiricahua, a man known for his skill in battle but also for the cruelty that lived in his eyes. The marriage would forge a new alliance, give her scattered people the protection of a stronger group. It was for the good of the people, they had said. But Nolan had seen the way Kale looked at her, with an ownership that had nothing to do with respect and everything to do with possession. She saw in him a life that would be a different kind of death, a slow smothering of her spirit. Refusing was unthinkable. It was a betrayal of her duty, but the faces of her dead parents were burned into her mind, and she knew they would not have wanted this life for her. So, 2 nights ago, under the sliver of a new moon, she had slipped away from the camp, with nothing but a small pouch of food and a water skin. She had fled into the wilderness, choosing the uncertainty of survival on her own over a life she did not want. The storm had caught her in the open, and the flash flood was a sudden, brutal accident of her desperate escape. By morning, the storm had passed. A weak, watery sunlight began to filter through the breaking clouds, making the wet landscape steam. The world outside was washed clean, and the air was fresh and cool. As the light grew stronger, it illuminated their small shelter, and Elias saw the gash on her arm. It was a long, ugly cut just below her elbow, caked with mud and dried blood, a wound she must have gotten when she was being thrown against the rocks in the flood. He rose to his feet. Naylin immediately tensed, her hand instinctively going to her side as if reaching for a knife that was not there. He held up his hands in a placating gesture and then pointed to his own arm, then to hers. He unhooked the metal canteen from his belt and uncorked it, then pulled a relatively clean strip of cloth from his saddlebag, which he'd retrieved after the rain had lessened. His intentions were clear. He approached her slowly, giving her every chance to refuse. She watched him, her eyes narrowed with suspicion, but she did not move away. She remembered her mother tending to her childhood scrapes with yucca root and warm water. The memory was a flicker of warmth in the cold apprehension she felt. She held out her arm. Elias knelt in front of her. His touch, when it came, was incredibly gentle. He poured a small amount of water over the wound, his fingers carefully washing away the grime. He was methodical, his movements precise and clinical, his focus entirely on the task. This was the second time his skin had met hers. The first had been a violation, an act of force and desperation that had left her spirit reeling. But this was different. This touch was respectful. It was an act of care. As he gently dabbed the clean cloth around the edges of the cut, a strange and confusing sensation stirred within Naylin. It was a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire, a feeling of being tended to, of being seen not as an enemy or an object, but as a person in need of help. It was a feeling she had not known since her mother's death, and it unsettled her more than his fear-inducing rescue. It cracked the hard shell of her hatred, and she did not know what to make of the vulnerability she felt underneath. When he was finished, he drew back. The immediate danger of the storm was over. The sun was climbing higher in the sky. They both knew they could not stay here together. The chasm between their worlds was as wide and real as the canyon outside. Elias stood and looked toward the high peaks of the mountains to the east, the direction her people would be. He pointed, a clear question in his eyes. Then he turned and gestured vaguely toward the sprawling plains to the west, where the white settlements lay, where his world was. The message was clear. They had to separate. The parting was heavy with things that had no words. He had saved her life. She had accepted his food and his care. A fragile, unnamed thing had passed between them in the shelter of the rock. But it had no place in the world outside. Elias found himself unwilling to let her go with nothing, on an impulse. He walked to where he had left his saddle and unstrapped the worn woolen blanket from his saddle roll. It was faded and patched in several places, but it was warm. He walked back and offered it to her. Naylin looked at the blanket, then at his face. Her pride, a fierce and unyielding thing, told her to refuse it. It was his. It smelled of him, of his world. To take it was to take another piece of him with her. But the memory of the night's shivering, bone-aching chill was too recent, too real. The nights in the mountains were cold, and she had nothing. Survival had to come before pride. She reached out and took the blanket from his hands. Her fingers brushed against his for a brief second. The contact was slight, but it sent a jolt through them both. She pulled her hand back as if burned, clutching the rough wool of the blanket to her chest. She lifted her head and met his gaze, holding it for a long, significant second. In that silent look, 1,000 things were exchanged. It was an acknowledgement of the debt, a flicker of gratitude, a confession of her confusion, and a final, somber goodbye. Without another glance, Naylin turned. She moved with a fluid grace, even in her exhaustion, and melted into the dense brush at the edge of the canyon. One moment she was there, a small, solitary figure clutching a gray blanket, and the next she was gone, swallowed by the wilderness as if she had never been. Elias stood alone by the riverbank, watching the spot where she had disappeared. The floodwaters had receded, leaving behind a wide scar of wet mud and tangled debris. The sun was warm on his face, and the birds were beginning to sing again. The world had returned to normal. But for Elias, something had fundamentally changed. He was alone again, just as he had been yesterday, just as he had chosen to be for 5 years. But the silence that descended now was different. It was no longer a comfortable companion. It was a hollow, echoing thing. The encounter had unsettled the deep, quiet solitude of his life, leaving behind an unexpected and disquieting void. He was alone, but for the first time, he felt lonely. A week after the storm, the hollow ache of loneliness had sharpened into a constant, unwelcome companion for Elias. The silence of his cabin, once a balm for his wounded soul, now seemed to echo with an emptiness he had not noticed before. The memory of the young Apache woman was an unquiet ghost in his home. He saw her in the corner where she had huddled, felt the ghost of her weight as he'd carried her, and at odd moments, he would find himself staring east toward the mountains, wondering if she had made it home, if she was safe, if she was warm in the blanket he had given her. The questions were a pointless exercise, but they persisted, unsettling the deliberate vacancy of his mind. His supplies were running low, a fact he could no longer ignore. With a heavy reluctance, he saddled Buck and made the half-day ride to the dusty settlement of Benson. The town was a raw gash on the landscape, a collection of sun-bleached, false-fronted buildings huddled together as if for protection against the vast emptiness that surrounded them. Dust, fine as flour, coated everything, stirred into lazy plumes by the occasional breeze or the passage of a horse. Benson was a microcosm of the West's unsparing realities, a place of hard work, cheap whiskey, and a casual disregard for life. Elias tied Buck to the hitching rail in front of the general store, the smell of coffee beans, leather, and salt pork spilling out of the open door. He bought what he needed: flour, coffee, beans, and a box of cartridges for his rifle, conducting his business with the storekeeper in a quiet exchange of nods and single-syllable words. His business concluded. He knew he should head back, but the gnawing loneliness pushed him toward the one place a man could go to feel the press of other humans without the obligation of conversation: the saloon. The high-stakes saloon was a long, narrow room, hazy with smoke and smelling of stale beer and unwashed men. A dozen patrons were scattered throughout, prospectors with the wild, hopeful look of madness in their eyes, grim-faced cowboys covered in the trail's dust, and a few sullen-looking townsmen. Elias took a spot at the far end of the bar, ordered a whiskey, and nursed it, observing the room from under the brim of his hat. His comfortable solitude was gone, replaced by a sharp and alienating sense of isolation. He was among men, yet he had never felt more alone. The memory of Nolan's face, a fleeting image of her fear giving way to a defiant strength, was more vivid and real to him than any of the living men in this room. It was then that the batwing doors swung open, and Jedediah Kane entered. Kane was a man who took up more space than his physical size warranted. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a fine but practical black coat and a clean, wide-brimmed hat. His face was weathered, but his eyes were the color of a frozen lake, cold and assessing. He was the cattle baron who had, through ruthless acquisition and intimidation, come to own most of the land in this corner of the territory. He saw the land not as a place to live, but as a thing to be conquered and tamed, and he viewed the Apache who had lived on it for centuries as nothing more than vermin to be cleared. Kane was followed by 2 of his ranch hands, men with hard faces and guns tied low on their hips. As they moved to the bar, a young Mexican boy who was sweeping the floor inadvertently backed into Kane's path. The boy stumbled, dropping his broom with a clatter. "Watch yourself, boy." Kane's voice was not loud, but it cut through the low murmur of the saloon. "My apologies, Senor Kane, I am sorry," the boy stammered, scrambling to pick up the broom. Kane looked down at him, a faint, cruel smile on his lips. "Sorry does not keep my boots clean." Without warning, he backhanded the boy across the face. It was not a hard blow, but it was swift and contemptuous, a gesture of casual cruelty meant to assert dominance. The boy cried out, more from shock and humiliation than from pain, and scurried away into a back room. Cain turned to the barman as if nothing had happened. "Whiskey." Elias watched the exchange, a cold knot tightening in his gut. He had seen men like Cain before, men whose wealth and power had curdled their humanity. He kept his eyes on his glass, wanting no part of the man or his world. But trouble had a way of finding a man who wanted only to be left alone. A grizzled old prospector, his face a roadmap of desert hardships, squinted at Elias from a few feet down the bar. "Say," the prospector rasped, his voice loud in the now quiet room, "ain't you the fellow with the cabin up in the Dragoon foothills?" Elias gave a slight, non-committal nod. The prospector grinned, showing a few tobacco-stained teeth. "Thought so. I was checking a claim up by the wash after that big storm last week. Saw you down there. You were with an Apache girl." The saloon, which had been regaining its low hum, fell completely silent. The scrape of a chair, the clink of a glass, every small sound ceased. Every eye in the room turned to Elias. To be seen with an Apache woman was not just unusual, it was a transgression, a crossing of an invisible but violently enforced line. Jedediah Cain turned his head slowly, his cold eyes fixing on Elias. He picked up his fresh glass of whiskey and walked down the bar, his two men flanking him like wolves. He stopped next to Elias, his presence a palpable threat. "My friend here says he saw you keeping some interesting company," Cain said, his voice a low purr of false friendliness. "Up in the foothills, after the storm." Elias did not look at him. He stared at the amber liquid in his glass. "I was by the river." "So I hear," Cain continued, leaning an elbow on the bar. "A man alone out here. I can understand him getting lonely. But you have to be careful about the kind of varmints you associate with. They carry disease. And worse, they attract more of their kind." His words were laced with a casual poison, each one a small, sharp jab. He was speaking for the whole room now, reinforcing the shared prejudice that held this fragile society together. "She was in the flood," Elias said, his voice low and flat. "She needed help." Cain let out a short, humorless laugh. "Help? You help a rabid dog by putting a bullet in its brain. You do the same for a rattlesnake, and you do the same for a redskin. That is the only kind of help they understand." He took a sip of his whiskey, his eyes never leaving Elias's profile. "Let me give you a piece of friendly advice. Stranger, this is our land now. We are building something here, and there is no place in it for them or for any man who sympathizes with them. A man who shares his fire with a savage is no better than a savage himself. He becomes an enemy of his own kind. Do you understand what I am saying?" The threat was unmistakable. Elias could feel the weight of every hostile stare in the room. He knew that to argue would be pointless and dangerous. To agree would be to betray a part of himself he had not realized he still possessed. He finished his whiskey in a single swallow and placed the empty glass on the bar. He finally turned and looked at Cain, his gray eyes steady. "I keep to myself," he said, the words clipped and final. He dropped a coin on the bar, turned his back on Cain, and walked out of the saloon. He did not look back, but he could feel Jedediah Cain's cold, calculating eyes on him, marking him, sizing him up, and filing him away as a problem that might one day need to be solved. Miles away, hidden deep within the rugged maze of the Dragoon Mountains, Nolin stumbled into the clearing that held her people's temporary rancheria. The journey from the white man's territory had been an arduous, 2-day trek. She was exhausted, her feet were sore, but a sense of desperate hope had propelled her forward. She was returning to her people, to the only home she had left. The camp was a small collection of hastily built wickiups, brush shelters that blended almost seamlessly with the surrounding landscape. But it was not the joyous homecoming she had dreamed of. The first person to see her was Cale, the warrior to whom she had been promised. He was practicing with his bow at the edge of the clearing, his powerful muscles moving with fluid grace. When he saw her, his stern face broke into a rare expression of relief. "Naylan," "You are alive," he said, striding toward her. "We thought the spirits had claimed you." "I am alive," she confirmed, her voice hoarse. Cale's relief, however, was fleeting. His eyes fell upon the worn, gray woolen blanket she clutched around her shoulders. It was clearly not of Apache make. It was the blanket of a white man. His dark eyes narrowed, and the warmth in his expression vanished, replaced by a cold, hard suspicion. "Where did you get this?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "It is a long story," Nayland said, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. "I must speak with the elders." Bound by honor, Nayland presented herself before the 3 elders of her band and her younger brother, Chayton, a boy of 16 with his mother's kind eyes, ran to her and embraced her, his face a picture of pure joy and relief. "I knew you would return, my sister," he whispered. In the smoky confines of the largest wickiup, Nayland told her story. She spoke of her flight, of the terrible storm, and of being swept away by the flash flood. She told them how she had been pulled from the water by a white man who lived alone in the foothills. As she spoke, she tried to choose her words carefully, to omit the most shaming detail. But Cale, who had followed her into the lodge and stood listening with his arms crossed, would not let it be. "You were in the water a long time. You say—" Cale interrupted, his voice laced with suspicion. "You were not breathing. How is it that you are alive now?" Nayland hesitated. The eyes of the elders were on her, patient but demanding. The law of the people was that the truth must be told. He pushed on my chest," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He forced the water out." "That is not all," Cale pressed, his jealousy making him cruel. "A man's spirit is in his breath. A drowned person cannot be brought back by pushing alone. Tell them the truth, Nayland. Tell them what the white man did." Under the intense, questioning gaze of the elders, the full truth was forced out of her, each word a burning coal in her throat. "He put his mouth on mine," she confessed, her eyes fixed on the dirt floor. "He breathed his air into my lungs." A catastrophic silence fell over the wickiup. The eldest of the council members, an old man with a face like a weathered rock, closed his eyes, his expression grim. The act she described was a profound spiritual violation. In the beliefs of the Chiricahua, the white man's spirit, his ghost, had been forced into her body. She was no longer purely Apache. She carried a contamination within her, a source of potential bad medicine that could bring misfortune to the entire band. Cale seized his opportunity. He stepped forward into the center of the lodge, his voice ringing with self-righteous fury. "She is unclean," he declared, pointing an accusing finger at her. "She has allowed an Inda to put his ghost inside her. She is tainted. She is unfit to be the wife of an Apache warrior. She would bring sickness to my lodge and bad luck to any children we might have. I will not have her." His public shaming was a devastating blow. The elders, bound by generations of tradition and fear of spiritual imbalance, had no choice but to agree. They looked at Nayland not with anger, but with a deep, sorrowful pity. She was no longer one of them. This was Nayland's greatest tragedy. She had survived the raid that killed her parents. She had escaped a marriage she did not want. She had lived through a deadly flood. She had fought her way back to the people who were her only source of identity and belonging in the world, only to have them cast her out. She was forced to build a small, crude shelter for herself on the far edge of the camp, away from the family fires. She was shunned. People would turn their heads when she passed. Children would be pulled away from her path. She was an outcast, a ghost among her own kind. The only person who did not abandon her was her brother. Chayton, loyal and loving, would secretly bring her food at night, his face etched with a sorrow and confusion that mirrored her own. "It is not right, my sister," he would whisper, pressing a piece of roasted rabbit into her hand. "You did not choose this. You were saved." "It does not matter what I chose," Nayland would reply, her voice hard and brittle. "It matters what they believe." Her heart, which had already been fractured by grief, began to harden with a new kind of sorrow, not just for her lost family, but for her lost place in the world, she was utterly alone. Weeks passed. The ostracism did not lessen. Naylin grew thinner, her eyes haunted. She had no future here. She could not join another band, as the story of her contamination would follow her. She could not survive indefinitely on the scraps Chayton brought her. She was adrift, with no anchor and no harbor. One night, as she sat shivering in her cold, lonely shelter, clutching the white man's blanket, a memory surfaced. It was the memory of his quiet care, the gentleness in his hands as he had cleaned the wound on her arm. It was the memory of his sad, lonely eyes. In her entire world, his was the only kindness she had known since the raid. He had inadvertently destroyed her life among her people, but he had also been the one to save her body from the river. A desperate decision began to form in her mind. She had nowhere else to go. The wilderness that had been her sanctuary was now just a slower form of death. There was only one place, one person, that represented a sliver of a chance. It was a terrifying, unthinkable choice to return to the world of her enemies, to the man who was the source of her curse. But he was also the only one who did not look at her with fear or condemnation. Believing she had nothing left to lose, Naylin waited until the camp was deep asleep and the moon was hidden behind the clouds, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the gray blanket. She slipped away from the camp under the cover of darkness. She turned her back on the only home she had ever known and began the perilous journey back towards the lone cabin in the foothills, drawn by the faint, desperate hope of finding sanctuary with the man who had both saved her life and taken it from her. The weeks following Elias's trip to Benson passed in a haze of uneasy solitude. The encounter with Jedediah Kane had left a bitter taste in his mouth, a grim reminder that the world he had tried so hard to leave behind had long arms. He had been marked, and he found himself spending more time watching the ridgelines, his rifle never far from his hand, but his vigilance was divided. His thoughts were constantly pulled eastward, toward the mountains, toward the woman whose face was now a permanent fixture in his mind. The void she had left had not been filled. It had only grown wider, a hollow space in the center of his quiet life. One evening, as twilight bled purple and orange across the western sky, a sound from outside startled him from his thoughts. It was the scrape of a boot on stone, followed by a low moan. It was not the sound of an animal. Elias was on his feet in an instant, his heart pounding a sudden, hard rhythm against his ribs. He grabbed the rifle leaning against the wall, his mind immediately jumping to Kane and his men. He moved silently to the cabin's single window and peered out into the deepening gloom. What he saw was not the swaggering menace of Kane's ranch hands. A figure was crumpled on the ground near his water trough, a small, dark shape against the dusty earth. For a moment, he could not make it out. Then the figure stirred, and the moonlight caught the glint of a worn gray blanket. His breath caught in his throat. It was her. Any fear he had of Kane, any thought for his own safety, vanished in a hot, overwhelming wave of protectiveness. He threw the door open and rushed to her side. It was Naylin, but she was a shadow of the woman who had left him weeks ago. She was gaunt, her face tight with fever, her lips cracked and dry. Her deerskin moccasins were shredded, and her feet were a raw, bloody mess from the long, harsh journey. She looked up at him as he knelt beside her, her dark eyes clouded with delirium and exhaustion, and then they rolled back in her head as she lost consciousness. He lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he remembered, as fragile as a bird. He carried her inside, into the sanctuary of his home, and gently laid her on his own cot. The cabin, which for 5 years had been a monument to his isolation, a fortress to keep the world out, was instantly transformed. It became their shared world, a fragile haven sealed off from the judgment and cruelty of the outside. For the next few days, Elias's life narrowed to the singular purpose of keeping her alive. The methodical routines of his solitude were replaced by the rhythms of caregiving. He cleaned the terrible wounds on her feet, his touch as gentle as he could make it, and wrapped them in clean strips of cloth. He used a cool, damp rag to wipe the sweat from her fevered brow. He boiled broth from the last of his venison and patiently spooned it between her lips when she was lucid enough to swallow. The nights were the longest. He sat in a chair beside the cot, the cabin lit by a single flickering candle, and listened to her ragged breathing. She would toss and turn, murmuring in her own language, her dreams haunted by ghosts he could not see. In these long, quiet hours, he watched her face, the proud lines softened by sickness, and felt a connection so fierce it startled him. He had spent years numbing himself to the world, and now this woman had breached his defenses and awakened a part of him he thought long dead. The instinct to protect, to nurture, to heal. It was a feeling he had not allowed himself since he had watched his own family succumb to a fever much like this one. This time, he would not fail. On the 4th day, her fever broke. She woke to find the morning sun slanting through the window and Elias asleep in the chair beside her, his head slumped on his chest, the rifle resting against his knee. She lay still, watching him. This man, who was the source of her exile, had also become her only refuge. He had saved her twice now. She looked around the small, sparse cabin, a table, 2 chairs, a stone hearth, shelves holding a few tins and a handful of books. It was the home of a man who owned nothing and wanted nothing, a man as lost as she was. When he woke, he found her watching him, her eyes clear for the first time. The walls of silence and mistrust between them, while not gone, seemed to have lowered. As she slowly regained her strength, they began to build a bridge across the chasm of their 2 worlds, 1 word at a time. Their communication was a clumsy but heartfelt pantomime at first. He would point to the bucket of water and say the word slowly, carefully, water. She would listen, her head tilted, and then repeat it, her voice soft, the word sounding strange and lovely on her tongue. Water. Then she would touch the fire in the hearth and give him her word for it. Ko. He learned that the sun was Shah, and the people, her people, were Ende. She learned that the structure they were in was a home, a word that seemed to hold a deep and sorrowful meaning for him. Each new word was a stone laid in the foundation of their understanding, a small victory against the vast silence that had separated them. They were creating a new language, one that belonged only to the 2 of them in this small, isolated space. Their love did not blossom in a sudden, dramatic moment, but grew slowly, gently, in a series of quiet, emotional discoveries. One afternoon, as he was cleaning his rifle, he saw her pick up his heavy canvas jacket, which had a long tear in the sleeve from a snagged branch. He had intended to patch it with clumsy, uneven stitches, but Nayland took a thin, sharp piece of bone she used as a needle and a handful of yucca fibers she had prepared, and with a skill that left him mesmerized, she began to stitch the tear. Her hands moved with a swift, sure grace, her stitches tiny and perfect. She was not just mending the cloth, she was making it whole again, stronger than it was before. He watched, fascinated, realizing that this woman, who seemed so vulnerable, possessed a deep, practical strength that he had never known. Another evening, as they sat by the fire, a profound quiet settled between them, comfortable now instead of tense. Nayland looked at him, her dark eyes full of an unspoken question. She had seen the deep well of sadness in him, the grief that he carried like a shroud, and in that quiet, safe space, Elias found himself doing something he had not done in 5 years. He began to speak of his past. The words were rusty in his throat, stiff and awkward from disuse. He told her about Pennsylvania, about the green hills that were so different from this hard, red land. He spoke of his wife, Sarah, of her laughter, and the way her hair smelled of chamomile. And then, for the first time, he spoke his son's name aloud. Thomas, he said, the single word a shard of glass in his throat. He told her how small the boy had been, how full of life, before the sickness had taken him. He spoke of his own helplessness, the guilt that had driven him west, the feeling that he had somehow failed them. Nayland listened, not understanding all the English words, but understanding perfectly the language of loss. She did not offer empty words of comfort. She simply listened, her presence a silent testament to his pain, her eyes reflecting a deep empathy that went beyond language. When he finished, his voice thick with unshed tears, she reached out and gently placed her hand on his arm, a gesture of pure, simple human connection. In that moment, he felt a measure of peace he had not thought possible. He discovered her spirit in the mornings, just before dawn. When the sky was a soft, pearly gray, she would slip out of the cabin and face the rising sun. One morning, he followed and watched from a distance. She stood straight and still, and as the first sliver of light broke over the mountains, she began to chant. It was not a loud song, but a soft, mournful melody that seemed to be woven from the silence of the desert itself. It was a song of sorrow, of remembrance, and of a stubborn, resilient hope. The beauty of it, the raw, honest emotion in her voice, pierced his lonely heart and filled it with a feeling so intense it was almost painful. They were two people who had lost everything. The world had taken their families, their homes, their place of belonging. They were both outcasts, adrift in a harsh and unforgiving landscape. This shared trauma, this profound isolation, created a bond between them that was stronger than any spoken promise. They found solace in the one person who could understand their pain without needing it explained. The physical attraction that had simmered beneath the surface since that first day by the river began to grow into an intense, undeniable desire, a longing not just for a body, but for a soul that understood. One afternoon, the sky grew dark, the air heavy and still. The low rumble of distant thunder echoed through the canyon, a sound that brought with it the memory of the storm that had first thrown them together. Nayland, who had been grinding corn on a flat stone, suddenly went still. Elias looked at her and saw that her face had gone pale, her eyes wide with a remembered terror. The sound of the thunder was a trigger, unlocking the trauma of the flood, the feeling of drowning, the fear of death. A single tear escaped her eye and traced a silent path through the fine layer of dust on her cheek, then another. She did not sob or make a sound, but simply sat there, imprisoned by the memory. Elias moved to her side and knelt in front of her. He did not know the words to comfort her, not in her language or his, so he acted on pure instinct. He reached out and, with the pad of his thumb, gently wiped the tear from her cheek. His touch was warm and steady. She looked at him, her eyes full of pain and vulnerability, and in that moment, the last remaining barriers between them dissolved. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She did not. He pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was not born of simple passion, but of a desperate need for human connection, for comfort, for acknowledgement. It was tender and sorrowful and deeply searching. It was a confirmation that in the sanctuary of this small cabin, they were no longer an outcast Apache woman and a grieving white man. They were simply Elias and Nayland, two souls who had found each other in the wreckage of their lives. Their lovemaking later that night was a healing act. It was a reclaiming of the intimacy that had first been forced upon them by the violence of the flood. There was no desperation, no violation. There was only a slow, gentle exploration, a profound emotional release, in each other's arms. They found the acceptance and the sense of belonging that the world had so cruelly denied them. For the first time in years, neither of them felt truly alone. Their fragile peace, built word by word, touch by touch, lasted for 2 blissful weeks. It was shattered one evening by a frantic pounding on the cabin door. Elias grabbed his rifle, his heart lurching. Nayland's eyes were wide with fear. He moved to the door, his body shielding her. "Who is it?" he called out. "Nayland!" a young voice cried from outside, speaking in the Apache tongue. "My sister! Are you in there?" Nayland gasped. "Chayton!" She rushed to the door, and Elias, after a moment's hesitation, unbarred it. Her younger brother stood on the threshold, his chest heaving, his face streaked with sweat and dirt. He had clearly run a great distance. He stared for a second at Elias, his expression a mixture of fear and defiance, before his eyes found his sister. I was so worried, Chayton said, his words tumbling out in a rush. I followed your tracks. It took me many days. I had to be sure you were safe. I am safe, my brother, Nylund said, her voice thick with emotion as she embraced him. But Chayton's face was grim. He looked past his sister at Elias, then back to her. You are not safe, he said, his voice low and urgent. Neither of you are. He brought dire news. Cale, his pride wounded and his rage left to fester, had not forgotten her. He had been speaking in the camp, trying to gather other young warriors, talking of a debt of honor. He spoke of finding Nayland and taking revenge on the white man who had soiled her, of cleansing the stain on his own name by shedding blood. And there was worse. 2 days ago, I was hunting in the hills near here, Chayton said, his eyes wide with fear. I saw riders. Not ND, they were white men, from the big ranch to the south. They were scouting the area, their tracks leading dangerously close to this canyon. I heard them talking. They were looking for this cabin. The blood drained from Elias's face. Cain's men. The world they had so carefully sealed out had found them. Their small cabin, once a haven, was now a trap. Their sanctuary was no longer safe. The world, in all its hatred and violence, was closing in. There was no warning. The fragile peace of their world was shattered not by a sound, but by a flicker of movement at the edge of the clearing. Caught by Elias's watchful eye, he was splitting wood for the morning fire, the air still cool and smelling of pine and damp earth. Nalin was inside, humming the soft, mournful song he had come to love. One moment, there was peace. The next, the world was holding its breath. He saw them then, a line of 7 riders emerging from the trees, their forms backlit by the rising sun. At their head was Jedediah Cain, his posture ramrod straight in the saddle, a man utterly confident in his right to be there. Beside him, looking nervous and out of place, was the grizzled old prospector from the saloon in Benson. The others were the hard-faced men Elias had seen with Cain before, hired guns with the dead-eyed look of men for whom violence was a simple trade. Elias dropped the axe. "Nalin," he said, his voice low and urgent, but not loud enough to carry. He backed slowly toward the cabin door, his eyes never leaving the riders. "Inside now!" She must have heard the tone, not the words, because she appeared in the doorway, her face a mask of confusion that quickly morphed into terror as she saw the horsemen. They fanned out, forming a loose, menacing semicircle around the small cabin, their intentions as clear and brutal as the rifles they held across their saddles. Cain's cold eyes scanned the scene, lingering on the small signs of a shared life, the 2 tin cups on the bench, the neatly stacked firewood. Then his gaze fell on Nayland, standing frozen in the doorway. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. It was a smile of vindication, the look of a man whose darkest suspicions had been proven correct, giving him all the justification he needed to unleash his hate. "Thorn!" Cain's voice boomed across the clearing, sharp and commanding. "I gave you some friendly advice in town, told you what happens to men who forget their own kind. It seems you are a slow learner." He gestured with his rifle toward Nalin. "You have got something that does not belong to you. Send that savage out, and we will let you walk away from this." Elias pulled Nalin inside and slammed the heavy wooden door, dropping the thick bar into place. His heart was a cold, heavy stone in his chest. Walk away. Cain was a liar. There was no walking away from this. "He will kill us both," Nayland whispered, her voice trembling but her eyes fierce. "Only if we let him," Elias said, his voice grim. He moved to the small window and shoved the wooden shutter into place. He did the same for the one on the other side of the cabin. Their world was now a dim, close space, smelling of wood smoke and fear. "There is a spare rifle under the cot," he said, his own rifle already in his hands, and a box of shells. What followed was a desperate, violent battle for their small world. Elias refused to answer Cain's calls, and the first shot from outside shattered the morning's quiet, splintering the wood of the door. The siege had begun. Elias with his steady hand and intimate knowledge of every angle of his home, became a deadly defender. He had cut small, strategic firing slits into the cabin walls long ago, a precaution against a danger he had never truly expected. Now, he used them. He would fire a single, careful shot from one, then move to another, making their numbers seem greater, keeping the attackers from getting close. Nalin, after the first shock of the attack, moved with a silent, focused grace that amazed him. The terror in her eyes was replaced by the steely resolve of a survivor. She loaded the spare rifle with swift, economical movements, her hands steady. She did not fire wildly. Instead, she became his eyes and ears, pressing herself against the log walls, listening, watching through the tiny gaps. "To the right," she would whisper in her language, her voice calm. "One man is moving behind the rocks." Elias would shift, fire, and a cry of pain from outside would confirm her words. They fought as a seamless unit, their movements and instincts perfectly aligned in a deadly dance. He was the anchor, the steady firepower. She was the motion, the senses of the hunter, anticipating the enemy's moves. In the crucible of the firefight, their love was forged into something new, a fierce, unyielding partnership. For an hour, they held them off. The two of them against 7, their small cabin a fortress of defiance against the encroaching tide of hatred. But they could not hold out forever. The volume of fire from outside was relentless, chewing at the log walls, sending splinters of wood flying through the dim interior. Their own ammunition was dwindling. Elias knew they had perhaps 20 rounds left between them. Cain knew it too. The gunfire from the attackers lessened, replaced by a tense silence. "Thorn!" Cain's voice called out again, closer this time. "You are running out of bullets. We are coming to burn you out. Your last chance to send the woman out." Elias saw a flicker of movement near the lean-to where he kept his hay. They were going to set it ablaze, use the fire to drive them out into the open. Despair, cold and sharp, began to prick at the edges of his resolve. And then, from the high ridge behind the cabin, came the sharp, distinct crack of a rifle. It was not from one of Cain's men. A cry of surprise and pain came from one of the attackers. Another shot rang out from the ridge, and another. Help had arrived from an impossible quarter. Elias peered through a firing slit and saw them, 3 figures moving with swift stealth among the boulders on the ridgeline, laying down a precise and deadly fire. At their head was Chayton. He had come back. With him were 2 other young Apache warriors, friends of his, Elias guessed, who had chosen loyalty to a boy they trusted over fealty to a bully like Cale. The attack was thrown into chaos. Cain's men, who had been focused on the cabin, were now caught in a terrifying 3-way firefight. They were exposed, trapped between the steady fire from Elias in the cabin and the surprise attack from the ridge. The clearing became a maelstrom of ricocheting bullets, panicked shouts, and the screams of a wounded man. Nalin was at the window, her rifle pressed to her shoulder, her face a mixture of hope and fierce joy. "Chayton!" she breathed. She began firing with renewed purpose. Her shots aimed not to kill but to pin Cain's men down, to support her brother's attack. The violent confusion was a whirlwind of smoke and noise. Jedediah Cain, however, was not a man who panicked. Amid the chaos, he saw the source of his problem. He saw a flash of movement on the ridge as Chayton, bold and brave, moved from behind one boulder to another, trying to get a better angle on the men pinned down below. Cain dropped to one knee, the fury on his face replaced by a cold, murderous calm. He raised his rifle, took careful aim, and squeezed the trigger. The single shot was almost lost in the cacophony, but its effect was absolute. On the ridge, Chayton jerked backward as if punched in the chest by an invisible fist. He stood for a frozen second, a look of stunned surprise on his young face, and then he crumpled to the ground. Nalin saw it all. She saw her brother, her brave, loyal Chayton, the last piece of her family, the only person from her old life who had not abandoned her, fall. A sound was torn from her throat, a sound that did not seem human. It was a terrible, soul-shattering cry of pure, unadulterated agony. It was the sound of a heart breaking, of a spirit being extinguished. It cut through the roar of the gunfire, a blade of pure pain that sliced through the air and into the ears of every man in the clearing. For one surreal, suspended moment, every man, on every side, froze. The shooting stopped. The world went silent, holding its breath in the face of such profound grief. That moment of hesitation was all Elias needed. The sound of Nolan's cry had shattered something inside him. The cool, calculating defender was gone, consumed by a white-hot rage, a grief for her loss that was so immense it burned away all thought, all fear, all reason. He kicked the bar from the door and burst out of the cabin, his pistol in his hand. His vision narrowed until the only thing he saw was Jedediah Kane, still kneeling, his rifle smoking. Elias fired twice. The first shot missed. The second slammed into the stock of Kane's rifle, tearing it from his grasp with a spray of splintered wood. Before Kane could react, before any of his men could recover from their shock, Elias was on him. He charged across the clearing, a primal roar of fury erupting from his chest, and tackled Kane to the ground. He landed on top of him, his pistol falling from his grip, and began to beat him with his bare fists. It was a brutal, merciless assault. He drove his right fist into Kane's face, then his left. He felt the crunch of bone, the wetness of blood. Kane tried to fight back, to shield himself, but he was no match for the explosive, grief-fueled strength that coursed through Elias. Elias grabbed Kane's arm, the one that had held the rifle, and twisted it until it snapped with a sickening crack. Kane shrieked, a high, thin sound of agony. Elias hit him again and again, the rage a red curtain over his eyes. He wanted to kill him. He wanted to beat the life out of this man who had brought such ruin to their world, who had stolen the last light from Nolan's eyes. He raised his fist for a final, fatal blow. But through the red haze of his fury, a sliver of reason penetrated. He saw not just Kane's bloody, whimpering face, but the wider consequences. A dead cattle baron, not a dead prospector or a nameless drifter, but a man of power and influence. His death would not be ignored. It would bring the full weight of the United States Army down on this canyon. It would bring a wrath that he and Nolan could never hope to survive. With a shuddering gasp, he stopped. His fist remained poised in the air for a long moment before he let it fall to his side. He was breathing in ragged, tearing gulps, his knuckles bloody and raw. The fight was over. On the ridge, Chayton's two friends, seeing their leader dead and the battle lost, did the only thing they could. They darted out from the rocks, grabbed Chayton's lifeless body, and vanished back into the mountains as silently as they had appeared. The surviving ranch hands, their leader broken and screaming on the ground, stared at Elias with a new, terrified respect. They scrambled to their feet, dragged the moaning, bloody form of Jedediah Kane onto a horse, and made a hasty, panicked retreat, leaving their dead behind. The gunfire ceased. An unnatural silence fell over the clearing, broken only by Kane's fading whimpers and another sound, a sound that was far more terrible. Nalan's heart-wrenching sobs. The cabin was scarred with bullet holes, a testament to the violence it had endured. The ground was littered with spent shell casings and stained with dark patches of blood. Their sanctuary was destroyed. Elias pushed himself to his feet, his rage draining away, leaving behind a cold, cavernous emptiness. He walked on unsteady legs to where the Apache warriors had been, to the spot where they had retrieved Chayton. A pool of blood was already soaking into the thirsty ground. Nalan was there, kneeling, cradling her brother's body in her arms, rocking back and forth in a state of catatonic grief. She was crooning a soft, broken lullaby, the same mournful tune she sang to the sunrise, but now it was shattered by her sobs. Elias knelt beside her in the dirt. He had no words. There were no words in any language that could touch this kind of pain. He simply put his arms around her and held her, his own heart breaking for her, for them, their love, which had been a fragile, beautiful thing grown in the quiet of this hidden canyon, had been paid for with the blood of the one person who had stood by her. They were utterly, completely alone, adrift in a sea of tragedy. The silence that followed the retreat of Cain's men was heavier and more profound than any silence Elias had ever known. It was a dead weight, filled with the ghosts of gunfire and the echo of Nalan's soul-shattering cry. The sun climbed higher, casting a harsh, unforgiving light on the scene of destruction. Their sanctuary was a ruin, their peace a forgotten dream. In the devastating aftermath, grief was a physical presence, a third person in the clearing with them, cold and immutable. The first task was the hardest. Nalan's terrible sobs eventually subsided into a state of stunned, silent misery. She did not release her brother's body but continued to rock him gently, her eyes vacant, staring at a world only she could see. Elias knew they had to move. They had to give the boy a proper resting place. But he did not know how. The customs of her people were a mystery to him. He could only wait. Hours passed. Finally, as the sun began its descent, Nalan stirred. She looked at Elias, her eyes dark pools of a pain so deep he could barely stand to meet her gaze. In a voice that was a mere ghost of itself, a whispered, grief-choked rasp, she began to give him instructions in her language, supplementing the words with gestures he could understand. He did as she commanded. He first went into the violated cabin and brought out the gray woolen blanket, the one he had given her. It was precious, their first connection. And now, it would be Chaitan's shroud. Together. They gently cleaned the blood from the boy's still form. Nalan combed his long black hair with her fingers, her movements tender and ritualistic. They wrapped him carefully in the blanket, a final act of love and protection. She led Elias away from the clearing, up a steep, rocky incline behind the cabin. Her strength was born of pure will, a final duty to her brother that transcended exhaustion and sorrow. She found what she was looking for, a deep, narrow crevice in a sheer rock face, high above the canyon floor, safe from the scavengers of the desert. Lifting the body up to the ledge was a difficult, solemn struggle. When Chaitan was finally laid to rest within the rock's embrace, they began the final task. For another hour, they worked in a shared, somber rhythm, gathering heavy stones and meticulously sealing the entrance to the crevice. Each stone was a final goodbye, a wall between the world of the living and the spirit of the dead. When they were finished, Chaitan was part of the mountain, forever watching over the canyon where his life had been so brutally taken. The ritual was complete. It was a profound and painful act that cemented their bond in a shared, unspeakable sorrow. They were no longer just two people in love. They were two people bound by the blood of an innocent. As they stood on the high ledge, looking down at the scarred clearing below, the reality of their situation settled upon them with crushing finality. They both knew they could not stay. The cabin was no longer a home. It was a crime scene, a monument to their loss. Jedediah Cain, broken but alive, would be back. He would send more men, or he would use his influence to bring the law down on them, painting Elias as a renegade and Nalan as a savage accomplice. And in the mountains, Cale, upon hearing of Chaitan's death in a fight involving a white man, would see it as a blood debt that had to be paid. They were fugitives now, hunted by both their worlds, with a price on their heads. They descended to the cabin in the fading light and salvaged what little they could. Their movements were heavy, mechanical. They took Elias's remaining rifle and the small amount of ammunition he had left. They filled a single water skin. Nalan took a sharp skinning knife, and Elias added a small pouch of salt and a flint and steel. It was a pathetic collection of supplies for two people about to face the wilderness, but it was all they had. With the sun setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the land, they stood for a moment before the cabin. It was the place they had found each other, the only home their love had ever known. Now it stood silent and empty, its door agape, its walls pocked with bullet holes. Without a word, they turned their backs on it and walked away. They did not head for the plains or the known trails. They headed southeast, toward the jagged, saw-toothed peaks of the Superstition Mountains, a vast and notoriously treacherous wilderness. a place where people were known to disappear forever. Their journey was a grueling test of body and spirit. The superstitions were a brutal, alien landscape of twisted rock formations, sheer cliffs, and labyrinthine canyons that all looked alike. The sun was a merciless hammer during the day, scorching the rock until it shimmered with heat. The nights were freezing, the cold seeping into their bones, a stark reminder of their vulnerability. Hunger became a constant, gnawing companion, and fear was their shadow, the ever-present dread of a tracker's keen eye or the sudden appearance of a posse on the horizon. The harsh, unforgiving landscape was a perfect mirror of their internal state, bleak, vast, and filled with peril. But the crucible of the wilderness stripped away everything but the essential. Grief, fear, and pain were luxuries they could not afford for long. All that mattered was the next step, the next sip of water, the next sunrise. Their reliance on each other became absolute. Elias, with his frontiersman's knowledge of terrain, navigated by the sun and stars, finding paths through the seemingly impassable rock. Nalin, with the knowledge of generations of her people, saved them time and again. She knew how to find water seeping from rock faces that looked barren. She could identify the edible roots of a yucca plant or the protein-rich grubs hiding under a stone. They were a perfect, symbiotic unit. He was the compass, she was the substance. They became each other's strength, each other's will to live. One night, weeks into their exodus, they found shelter in a shallow cave overlooking a deep, silent canyon. They were on the brink of exhaustion, their bodies lean and hard, their features weathered by the elements. They built a tiny, smokeless fire of dry mesquite, its warmth a small comfort against the vast, star-filled darkness. Huddled together under a single blanket, they finally talked, not of survival, but of the future, and of the ghosts they carried. It was Nalin who spoke first, her voice a low murmur in the immense quiet. She spoke of her guilt. She believed her choices had forged the path to her brother's death. If she had not fled her people, if she had not come to this cabin, Chaitin would still be alive. The words were a poison she had been holding inside, and now she let them out into the safe darkness. Elias listened, his heart aching for her, and when she was done, he, in turn, fully opened himself up. He spoke of the guilt he had carried in silence for years, the terrible, nagging belief that he could have done more to save his wife and son. He told her how he had been away, fetching a doctor from another town, and by the time he returned, the sickness had taken a fatal hold. He had tortured himself with the what-ifs, the belief that if he had just been there, he could have somehow changed their fate. In the vast, silent darkness of the wilderness, surrounded by the indifferent stone of the mountains, they offered each other absolution. He told her that Chaitin had made his own choice, a brave choice born of love for his sister, and that the guilt belonged only to the man who pulled the trigger. She, in turn, made him see that he was not a god, that he could not have stopped a force as relentless as cholera, and that the only thing he had been guilty of was loving his family. They acknowledged the brutal truth of their existence. There was no place for them in the world they had left behind. They were no longer white or Apache, they were something else, a new, two-person tribe forged in a crucible of sorrow. They made a solemn vow, not with words, but with a long, deep look of understanding that passed between them in the flickering firelight. Their life would be with each other, or it would not be at all. They wandered for what felt like an eternity after that night, moving deeper into the heart of the mountains. They were on the verge of collapse, their water skin empty, their hope worn thin, when they stumbled upon it. After climbing a high, narrow pass, they looked down into a sight so unexpected it seemed like a fever dream. Nestled between impassable, sheer peaks was a small, hidden valley. A natural spring flowed from the base of the mountain, creating a stream that snaked through the valley floor, giving life to a sliver of impossible green, cottonwood trees, thick grasses, and wildflowers in the middle of the desert rock. It was a place of myth, a secret garden hidden from the world. It was a place to be lost, a place to start again. Months passed. The harsh sun of summer gave way to the milder autumn, then the chill of winter. The story concludes not with a grand resolution, but with a quiet, powerful image of hope. Elias and Nalin, their features weathered and browned by the sun, their bodies leaner and stronger from months of hardship, are working together. They are building a small, sturdy shelter against the base of the cliff, using stones from the mountainside and adobe mud mixed with grass and water from the spring. Their movements are efficient and synchronized, a silent dance of two people who have become one entity. He lifts the heavy stones into place. She fills the gaps with the mud, her hands skillful and sure. There is no need for words between them. They move as if guided by a single thought, a shared purpose. The final image is of them pausing their work as the afternoon sun casts a golden glow over their hidden valley. They stand side by side, looking at the rough, sturdy walls of the home they are building. There are no smiles on their faces. The memory of all they have lost is too fresh, the scars on their souls too deep. But in their eyes, as they look at their new beginning, there is a shared look of fierce determination and a profound, weary peace. They have lost everything, their families, their homes, their worlds, but they have survived. And in this forgotten corner of the world, their love is not a crime, and their quiet, shared existence is its own form of justice. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. And do not forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel to share your thoughts in English.